Hey everybody, it's Kumasi, and I just wanted to check in because there has been so much going on, from Amy Cooper calling the police on Christian Cooper while he was bird watching in Central Park, to that horrible video that we've had to watch over and over and over again, it seems like, on the news and on social media, of George Floyd being killed while saying that he can't breathe, and the protests that have erupted because of that video, because of what happened. I think it's fair to say that at this point, people are angry, but also looking for solutions. And so that inspired me to do this video, because what are the next steps? What are the solutions? What do people want? What things could actually create long-lasting change? So I think the person that would be good to talk about this is my friend Paul Henderson, and he is an attorney. He worked for a long time as a prosecutor, and he's currently the executive director of the Department of Police Accountability in San Francisco. So I video chatted him. Here's a little bit of our chat. I hope that you find it to be really helpful. All right. Hi, friend.
Hi, Kumasi. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. I'm excited to have this conversation with you because so much has been happening. And I think we are still in a point where we're seeing people are just really frustrated, calling for change. But as I sat back and looked at everything, I'm like, well, what does that change look like? People have been calling for change before, but clearly there have been obstacles and roadblocks that have stopped people from achieving this change that we want to see. So I thought, my friend Paul, he can help us as we navigate these things, because you're an attorney, prosecutor, and now working with the Department of Police Accountability. So quite a career friend, and you can help us with this. So thank you.
No, thank you for having me. It's really an important topic, and especially right now, I think the whole nation wants to have this conversation, and your work in bringing this conversation to the forefront and unpacking some of the more complicated issues around the disparities in our justice system, I think couldn't be more timely and couldn't be more well received from the audiences throughout this country. And certainly from a source like you of credibility actually makes all the difference. And it's one of the tools that we have in order to move forward and try and make a change. So,
well, thank you, friend. All right, so let's get to it. I feel like when we have this conversation about things that have stopped accountability, people talk about police unions, people talk about the relationship that district attorneys have, with police, and the hesitation to charge and to prosecute. Then we have qualified immunity, which is just a whole other thing to discuss. In your experience, what do you think has been the biggest roadblock when it comes to accountability for police?
Well, I don't think it's a singular thing. I think they're all related to each other when we talk about our justice system. And all of these problems are systemic, right? And they are both subjective and intransigent. And that's why I think there's such a high level of frustration across the country, because it seems like we have to keep learning the same related lesson over and over again. So in one county, we're not allowed to jog. In another county, we're not allowed to walk in the park. And in a different city, we can't have a warrant executed properly in the same ways that other warrants are executed. And in some cities, we don't have law enforcement charged in the way that normal defendants get charged. It's like all of these things that continue happening. It feels like Groundhog's Day for communities of color that are watching these instances take place that are now recorded, right? So they're brought into our living rooms every week, and we're like, that is outrageous. And then when we look to see what the accountability is for those incidents that we're all watching, of Freddie Gray, of like Tamar Rice, of, Trayvon Martin, all of the things, and right now with George Floyd, it's like, what do we do? We have to do something. And communities are frustrated, and then they're instigated by these transgressions that we see recorded. And I think that's a real problem, but it has to do with a bigger approach, but we have to take solid steps in order to move it forward. I think those solid steps are taken by having an informed audience. And so that's why conversations like this are so important. We can't fix what we don't talk about. And so many of the decisions that are being made around our justice system are decisions and conversations that take place outside of community, that we really have to have thought leaders at the table, and we really have to have community at the table to identify exactly what the problems are and exactly what the solutions can be.
So when you think about that, what do you see as the problems?
I think the problems start at the local level, right? Like, and for a number of reasons that we can talk about, I don't think we have the luxury of being able to rely on the federal government to lead us out of this. And so a lot of the solutions, I think, can begin at a local level. I mean, one of the first things that I would suggest to communities to be asking about is, do you have civilian oversight in your law enforcement agencies? There's over 17,200 law enforcement agencies in this country, and yet there's only 200 civilian oversight agencies for those agencies. And that's best practices. I mean, these are some of the things that we get from 21st century policing that we got under the Obama administration, indicating how to address specifically police reforms. And this is just the beginning of the conversation, because we can't just focus on law enforcement, although they play a very important role in this conversation, because oftentimes that's the entry point into the pipeline of disparities that we see throughout the criminal justice system. And while we're focusing on police, let me just say, because this, I think, is really important. It's just as important that we are able to hold police accountable and tell them what they can't do and shouldn't do, as much as we demand about things that they have to do and should do. And that's where I think we have the disconnect, and they have to be married together, because we have to monitor and make sure that there is accountability for misconduct, particularly when we already know that there's a disparity in the way that policing is done in this country as it relates to Black and brown communities. I mean, these are just facts. And what do we do with these facts determines how we move forward. So that's one of the things that I think are really important, is having some sort of police oversight in a lot of these cities that people could do. And then, I would say we have to extend that and look at what we're doing in terms of local prosecution. How are these cases of misconduct being handled? Why is it that we have the grand jury invoked whenever there's a law enforcement officer? Because no one else in the community has that luxury, or very few people have that kind of luxury of having a grand jury to determine whether or not they're either taken into custody or charged with a criminal crime. And, even just looking at that process itself, where we get 12 people to confer the benefit of the doubt on an incident, which is something totally separate from an elected or appointed official making a determination independently as to whether or not a crime has been committed. And it's the subjective and intransigent decisions that are in our criminal justice system that lead us to many of the problems that we're seeing today, and many of the voices that we're hearing from the communities right now saying that this has to change. It's all been a flashpoint around George Floyd, but these are systemic problems that communities of color have been talking about for decades that continue to persist. And we keep seeing the evidence of that again and again. I mean, that's what we see the news stories and the videos of.
So, Paul, that's my question. If we keep seeing this happen, and we have heard Black people of color pushing for this change, no doubt people have already asked for police oversight in their communities, but for some reason that hasn't happened. So what are the obstacles that are preventing this oversight committees and things of that nature from being really at every police department?
Well, we certainly could have them, but it's just a matter of the community's voices being heard, right? And we know, I mean, this is like the famous Martin Luther King quote, is that riots are the voice of the unheard. We've been asking for these things, but in some cases we haven't known to ask specifically for that. But now that we're getting more information about what is possible, and we see more of the injustices in our face when we see these videos of like, how can that happen? But there has to be an answer to that question, and we have to hold folks accountable, and we have to hold law enforcement agencies accountable for answering that question, but then implementing changes to make sure that they happen. This is a flashpoint right now where things can happen We just have to demand the right things. And we don't have the luxury of relying on the state or federal government in many instances to correct the transgressions that are taking place in our city and towns. I mean, right now, we talk about in the federal government, and this administration is not taking the lead in addressing many of these concerns. We still haven't had a clear and direct conversation and quote from this administration about what's happening throughout this country. I think that's a problem. But the way to address that is by voting. You know, if we are looking even to the systems that the federal government has in place with the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice has shrunk to less than half of what it was in the last administration. What does that mean? Do those cases and have those issues gone away? We see by the proliferation of what's happening in the news and on television that it absolutely has not. We haven't seen a major investigation open or a major case pattern and practice investigation open in this entire administration. That really sends a clear message to states and to cities that this administration doesn't value in the same way the voices that we're hearing right now from communities. The shift has been in that Department of Justice to focus on individual actors and individual bad acts. And the problem with that approach is that it doesn't address the systemic problems that underlie what's wrong with our criminal justice. So it looks like two separate tracks of justice, one for communities of color and then one for everyone else. And that's just a problem that I think is best addressed at a local level.
Yeah. Paul, I also think when we're talking about the federal level is to talk about qualified immunity, because I think that has a big impact on what we're seeing, because a lot of the question around what happened with George Floyd, I think, was that people were like, well, if you or I did that and we were caught on video doing that, then we would automatically, be arrested on the spot and we'd be in jail right now. But
Correct.
It's not the same when a police officer does something as when you or I or anybody else does something. And a lot of that has to do with that. So I think that's something that we should talk about, because qualified immunity, it plays a huge role in what we see play out.
It does. And these are protections that are built into our system that offer presumptions for law enforcement agencies. And those presumptions, to the degree we agree or disagree about them, are relevant right now. In fact, there are 13 cases in the pipeline to be decided by the Supreme Court right now. So what does that tell us about what's going to happen and how those cases are adjudicated and determined? The Supreme Court is one of those things that we have to take action about or be proactive about or stay committed to revolving. And there are organizations right now that are focused on trying to shine the light on some of those problems and trying to find solutions about what we can do. Activism right now that we can take to address concerns about the Supreme Court. One of them that I'm familiar with is Take Back the Courts, and the work that they're doing to try and make sure that we have better solutions and a more rounded court that isn't focused on politics, that isn't determined by the individual parties, but is more based on a broader reflection of community input. And that's ultimately what we want for a more fair system in the first place. But coming back to the qualified immunities, these are just some of the things that we know have to be challenged and questioned, like everything in our departments, or our justice departments, because the outcomes seem to be unfair, no matter how you slice it. And I can give you a perfect example. The forensic reports just came out today for George Floyd, and the independent analysis came out that says that the death for George Floyd was asphyxia from sustained forceful pressure on the neck. But the official autopsy that came out from the law enforcement agencies and from the city said that there was no finding to support the diagnosis of asphyxia or strangulation took place, and that there were underlying health records or health issues that may have contributed to his death. Now, and to me, this is like a perfect example of communities not being able to rely on scientific evidence that is supposed to be objective. And for whatever reason, it's not. Whenever there's a benefit of the doubt, it seems as though in many instances or in reoccurring instances that when it is a community of color that's involved with a confrontation or an interaction with law enforcement, that benefit of the doubt does not fall in the way of supporting the community. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have interactions every single day that is perfectly fine, appropriate, and peaceful between communities of color and law enforcement. But there are certainly flashpoints and examples that have been proven and shown again and again that belie our own independent observations of what we are seeing recorded on body-worn camera, of what we see recorded on individual folks in the community taking video recordings of transgressions that we see that seem absolutely and abundantly clear, and yet the results lead us to either marginalized accountability or no accountability in some really big instances. And that's the foundation of the frustration. And that's what we have to focus on. And that's what we have to deal with and address in a more meaningful way.
Yeah. I think it's tough because when we talk about qualified immunity and how difficult it is to establish, like, that someone's constitutional rights have been violated, in your time, you know, as a prosecutor, when you're thinking about that, how much does that impact the charges that are filed, if they are even filed, against an officer, knowing that that is a factor? Does that impact the charges or the lack of charges that we see against officers?
100%. All different. That's why I said it's a pipeline, right? And so you have to look at, I think the answer to addressing this stuff is trying to figure out both, are we collecting data and are we analyzing data to see that and confirm that there actually are differences? And this isn't subjective, these are just facts. Is that community at rates multiple times more than the rest of the community, that people of color do have lethal force used against them at multiple rates beyond that of the regular community. And those transgressions and those disparities translate into the rest of the criminal justice system as well. They're charged at a higher rate. They are charged at a different rate of higher challenges, legal challenges to themselves when they come to court. The sentencing disparities are ridiculous as well. It's over 20% for the exact same crime. For just, if you take race out of it, the communities of color are sentenced at a 20% higher race than everyone else for the exact same offenses. I mean, it goes all the way through the system. And then we can look at these individual cases, and there's always a defense to, well, in that case, it was this. But we're never speaking to the bigger picture of the facts and the statistics that we have that prove that race is a factor throughout the criminal justice system. And the solutions have to be the same. The solutions have to address race disparities in the same way. That's what I feel isn't really being talked about. And that's what we have to address. And, you know, I can give you another example because I like specific examples of things that have happened. So like with the Breonna Taylor situation where they executed the warrant, a no-knock warrant, and they shot her 8 or 9 times in her home. She is not the suspect. She had done nothing wrong, but those no-knock warrants were conducted in a way that have been restricted in many jurisdictions throughout this country because they are unsafe, both to the targets and to law enforcement as well. But the decision was made to use a no-knock warrant in her case. And why is that? We have to ask these questions. And again, this raises some of the issues that I think allow us to take steps in our own communities. We should be asking. This doesn't cost you in terms of your budget to ask and to know, does your local jurisdiction, when was the last time they updated their use of force guidelines? Most cities, a lot of cities have not updated their use of force guidelines in decades. And those use of force guidelines now reflect best practices, but if they haven't been updated, they still allow things like shooting at cars. They still allow practices like restrictive neck techniques. They still allow practices like no-knock notices for warrants. And these are the kind of questions that we have to be asking. And these are the kind of esoteric answers that we have to be demanding from our local jurisdictions at every level. That's just how we have to move this forward. That's what needs to come out of these rallies, of these protests, of these riots, is an informed solution of accountability that changes the system, that adopts policies that are race neutral, that enforces changes that dismantle the disparities in our justice system. That really is the solution. What's my solution? It's the solution that I think we need to have in order to move forward, according to Paul.
The solution according to Paul. Well, Paul,
right.
I mean, it's a great start. And the beauty of this is I think that we will have so many voices coming together to offer up ideas and offer up solutions, because I think people from all areas and walks of life have agreed that they want to see some type of change. So I appreciate you sharing with us your solutions and your ideas. It definitely gives us some ideas of how to move forward and to motivate people who are angry but want to say, what can I do? So
yeah. I'm just happy to be here, part of the conversation. I just want the justifiable, righteous indignation channeled towards what can be a complex solution, but it's a solution nonetheless, and it's a solution that will make a difference for the rest of the communities that are frustrated right now. And so I'm just eager and happy and excited that you're having this conversation, because it's not an easy conversation to have while so many people are suffering. It's not an easy conversation to have while there are riots and people are scared. And it's not an easy conversation to have while we are still struggling in the backdrop of coronavirus and being quarantined. And these issues have surpassed the blanket that coronavirus has put on this country. And so it's still popping up and creating an emergency, and now new curfews independently because of the race disparities that we have in the United States. And so I thank you and I applaud you for initiating the conversation and sharing it with your audiences, because I think it's an important one, and I appreciate that your voice is part of the solution. So thank you.
Thank you, friend.
You're welcome, friend.
So what did you think of the conversation and of the solutions that Paul suggested? Please let me know what you think. Leave your ideas in the comments, because it's one thing I truly believe is that there is no one answer to solve these issues. It's really going to take everybody coming together. And I think even with all of the pain that we feel and all of these things that are going on, that is what I'm most looking forward to, people coming together to find solutions to these issues. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.